empirically, there's a law out there called the 80-20 rule. I'm sure you know it, right? So of 100% of anything, it breaks into two groups, 80% of one majority, 20% of another majority, right? Or a minority, right? So the first thing to understand is the 80-20 rule applies to all of our personal interactions as well. So if we have a 2-hour interview, and that's the 100% of our time together is just that 2-hour interview, right? 50% of the time was just 1 hour. 20% of the time was what? What's 20% of 120 minutes? 24 minutes. So 24 minutes, according to the 80-20 rule, there will only be 24 minutes that I even remember. Out of the 120 minutes that we were together, there's only going to be 24 minutes that I remember. On top of that, we also have to layer on the idea that people overvalue their losses and undervalue their wins. It's another mental model that we know about, right? Well, so the losses and the wins that I'm undervaluing and overvaluing are not yours. They're mine. So of the 24 minutes that I remember,
I see.
The majority of those 24 minutes are going to be me remembering the losses that I had, the things I screwed up on. That's exactly what you're talking about when you're like, people go back and they have that anxiety.
Exactly, yeah.
But the 24, guess if I'm worried about the 24 minutes that I sucked at, guess what you're also doing?
Mine that I sucked at. And then
you're not thinking about me.
We're not thinking about each other's, yeah.
So then 80-20 rule applies again. So now what's 80, now in 24 minutes, 20% of 24 minutes, because we're only going to remember 24 minutes.
5 minutes,
5 minutes is what we're going to remember of the other person. And in that 5 minutes of the other person, essentially we're going to remember what they did the best, because we're going to overvalue their wins and undervalue our losses. That's something called a cognitive distortion, where you give people more credit than you give yourself for the same task. So just to recap, 120-minute conversation. Both of us are only really going to remember 24 minutes. And if of that 24 minutes,
we're thinking of ourselves.
We're bashing ourselves for 19 of those minutes. And for 5 of those minutes, we're remembering the highlights of what the other person did. Once you understand that, then you start to realize that every single dipshit that you meet out there, every single one of them, they're only remembering 20% of their last conversation with you. And by default, they're most likely going to remember the best parts, meaning the most emotionally charged moments.
It's like the saying that people remember how you made them feel, not what they say. Is that kind of
that's exactly right.
What that's encompassing?
So that doesn't mean that everybody remembers, because we all have plenty of situations where we remember people negatively. But that's because in that 5 minutes that we remember them, the most impactful thing they did was made us feel bad. You've made me feel good a number of times today.
I needed that, thank you.
So the 5 minutes that I'm really going to remember of this conversation, until I watch the interview later, the 5 minutes are going to be, Brett laughed at this and he was kind about that and he was friendly about this and that guy made me feel good and I'll go back on his podcast. Right? Okay. That's how it's going to work. And the same thing is going to happen if you apply this framework to yourself. When you leave, you're going to be like, oh, the 5 minutes I remember about Andy are he was this and he was that and he was this. And hopefully those are all good things, because the final framework for CIA is always to leave people with a positive taste in their mouth. Always. Because if somebody remembers you positively, you have 2 benefits. One, they're not going to remember you very long. We don't value our wins. We overvalue our losses, right? So if you have a positive experience with somebody, they're going to forget you faster. But when the time comes that you want to talk to them again or meet with them again, and they recall you in that moment, it will be a positive recollection. When you leave somebody negatively, it actually takes, empirically, cognitively, it takes people longer to forget a negative experience than for them to forget a positive experience. So now you are actually remembered longer if you give somebody a negative experience. And then when you come back to them in the future, what they recall is negative.
When you say leave, do you mean the sum total or the last thing you say?
The sum total.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because again, the last thing you say, there is an element of cognitive value on the way you part rather than the way you meet, which goes completely in the face of any business lesson that has ever told you that first impressions are so important. First impressions are not important. Last impressions are the impressions that last. That's what we always tell ourselves at CIA. Last impressions are the impressions that last. First impressions are a dime a dozen. You can fuck up the first impression all the time. But the last one is by far the most important compared to the first one. However, it's the sum total of how you make someone feel that really makes them remember you. Which is why if you've ever had a date where like it started awkward, there was some really fun stuff in the middle, but then by the end it fizzled out. It fizzled out, or somebody got called back home, or like, oh, your sister needs you, or oh, my mom needs me, and it's like a rushed end of a date. You still feel good about the date because you don't remember the end. You remember all the cool stuff in the middle. The same thing is true about any other conversation that we have.